What if a tragedy struck your family so hard it felt like fate itself had turned against you? A father and his twin daughters die on the exact same day. But when the caskets are opened at the funeral, something chilling happens, something no one can explain. Was it a mistake? Or a message from beyond the grave? Stay with us. This story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about life and death. It was a cold October morning when the residents of Black Hollow woke up to the devastating news. Martin Hayes, a respected single father, and his 10-year-old twin daughters, Lily and Lucy, were found dead on the same day. But the strange part wasn't the timing, it was the locations. Martin was found in his study at home, a faint smile on his face. Lily was found in the woods near the old cemetery. And Lucy? She was discovered in the basement, in the dark, alone. No signs of struggle. No explanation. Just the chilling fact that all three had passed in separate places, but at the exact same time. The town was shaken. But what was worse was the feeling. Something felt off, like there was more to the story than anyone realized. The funeral of Martin and his daughters was held at the old chapel on the edge of town. The service was quiet, somber. Mourners, many of whom had known Martin for years, tried to keep their emotions in check. But as the ceremony progressed, an eerie feeling started to creep through the room. The three caskets were lined up at the front. The air felt heavier than it should have. It was as if something or someone was watching. And as the priest delivered his eulogy, there was a sudden, unsettling sound, like a faint whisper in the background. I spy. With my little eye. Everyone turned, but no one could figure out where the voice came from. The strange whisper repeated itself several times, and it sounded so much like Lucy's voice that it left chills running up people's spines. But no one could explain it. There was nothing more disturbing than the fact that no one had heard it until it was too late. As the wake went on, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more distinct. Guests reported hearing Lily's voice in the middle of the chapel, saying things like, "We're not alone." Others heard Lucy's voice. But something was wrong, too wrong. A woman approached the caskets, and what she saw made her scream. Both Lily and Lucy had matching black necklaces, tiny coffin-shaped pendants, hanging around their necks. No one had seen these before. No one knew where they came from. But the truly terrifying thing, the necklaces were warm to the touch. As she examined them closer, she noticed something else. The dates on the pendants were not of their deaths, but of a week into the future. And this was only the beginning of the strange events unfolding. The chapel was unnervingly silent. Not a single sound filled the space, save for the soft echoes of hushed footsteps and the quiet, muffled sobs of mourners trying to find comfort in each other's company. But there was something wrong about the stillness. It wasn't the natural quiet of a funeral. It was a thick, suffocating pressure in the air, as though the entire room had drawn in its breath, holding it, waiting for something to happen. It was as if the chapel itself had become a living entity, its walls pressing in closer with each passing moment. Every movement felt amplified, every rustle of clothing, every shift of feet. And in the center of it all were the three caskets, lined up in front of the mourners, beneath the towering stained glass window. The sunlight outside flickered erratically, casting fleeting patches of light and shadow across the pews. But it was the shadows cast by the caskets, that began to grow. Strange. Unnatural. The figures they formed seemed to shift, moving with a life of their own, stretching longer and darker as the sky outside turned gray and heavy. It was almost as if the shadows were reaching out, wrapping themselves around the caskets. The candles along the aisle started behaving in ways they shouldn't. Some of them flared too bright, their flames dancing in chaotic patterns. Others sputtered and smoked, flickering out completely before reigniting with an unnatural urgency, each flame behaving as if it had a mind of its own, creating an uncomfortable dissonance in the atmosphere. It was as though the light in the room was being distorted, as though it didn't belong. And then, there it was, a whisper, soft at first, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I spied, with my little eye. It was unmistakable. Lucy's voice. Clear, crisp, like a child's playful tune. But there was something wrong with it. It sounded distant, but not far enough to be imagined. It felt unnervingly close, as though the voice were coming from the very walls around them. The words echoed in the space, settling into every corner, chilling the bones of everyone who heard it. The air grew colder, so cold that some of the mourners shivered despite being wrapped in layers of warm clothing. And then, a child's laugh. It was high-pitched, a laugh that had no place in this grim setting. But it wasn't joyful. It wasn't innocent. It was taunting, as if the laughter itself was mocking the sorrow that filled the room. And then, the caskets moved. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. The caskets began to tremble, as though something inside them was shifting. The movement was small at first, but it grew, each tremor becoming more violent, until the caskets were shaking on their own. It wasn't natural. Nothing about it was natural. Mourners stared in horror as the tremors intensified. The caskets trembled harder, as though the dead inside were trying to rise. The smell of the earth, of damp soil, filled the room suddenly, the smell of a grave, making it even harder to breathe. Guests were paralyzed with fear. Some were frozen in place, unable to move. Others clutched their loved ones, their faces pale with terror. The laughter grew louder, more distinct. Lucy's voice joined in again, whispering the same words. I spied, with my little eye, and just when the air became so thick it felt like it could collapse on itself, the priest faltered in his speech. His hands trembled, his words catching in his throat, as if he too were hearing the voices. He couldn't continue. The room was no longer a chapel, it was a nightmare. The voices grew louder, the shadows twisted, and the caskets, they wouldn't stop trembling. The priest tried to continue, but his voice was lost beneath the rising crescendo of the eerie whispering. The mourners were no longer able to focus on him. Their attention was drawn to the caskets, to the trembling, the whispering, the unnatural cold that gripped them. Something was happening. Something no one could explain. Something that no one could deny. The atmosphere in the chapel had become unbearable. It felt as though the very air was charged with electric tension, each breath heavy with the weight of something unseen, something lurking beneath the surface. The mourners were no longer able to look away from the caskets. They were transfixed, rooted to the ground, unable to process what was happening. The trembling didn't stop. It grew steadier, more deliberate. The movement inside the caskets became impossible to ignore, each one shaking with an almost unnatural rhythm, like a heartbeat reverberating through the room. A low hum filled the space, growing louder, resonating in the very bones of everyone present. Then, with a sudden, bone-rattling jolt, the lids of the caskets began to shift. At first, it was subtle, just a small creak, as if the wood was being forced open from the inside. But it didn't stop there. The caskets began to jerk, the lids rising, inch by inch, as if something or someone was trying to break free. The sound was deafening. The wood creaked under immense pressure, like it was being pulled, forced open by an invisible hand. The priest stepped back, his face turning pale as he muttered incoherently under his breath, his hands shaking. The mourners gasped, some stumbling backward, unable to tear their eyes away from the sight before them. One by one, the lids rose. Martin's casket was the first to budge. The lid creaked open, revealing a sight that no one was prepared for. His eyes were wide open, locked in an unnatural, unblinking stare. His lips were curled into a twisted, grotesque smile, a smile that didn't belong on a dead man's face. But the worst part, the inside of the lid was scratched with something. Words. Not just a few marks, but deep, frantic carvings that hadn't been there before, words that were impossible to decipher. The scratches seemed too fresh, as if they had been made only moments ago. The casket holding Lily also began to tremble violently. The lid lifted slowly, agonizingly slow, revealing a sickly, pale hand that appeared from within, its fingers curled in an eerie, stiff motion. The hand reached out, as though trying to grasp the edge of the coffin, but stopped just short of touching the air, as if it were testing something invisible. And then there was Lucy's casket. The lid didn't just rise, it shattered. With a horrifying crack, the top of the casket burst open, sending pieces of wood scattering across the chapel floor. The room was filled with an intense, oppressive silence for a moment, as though everything was waiting. The dark, eerie laughter from earlier echoed in the distance, but it didn't come from the casket, it came from the walls. The voice was no longer childlike. It was deeper, distorted. A shadow appeared from within the broken casket, dark and indistinct. It moved like a cloud of smoke, twisting and spiraling upward, but it didn't seem to have a clear form. The shadow hovered in place for a moment before drifting toward the stained glass windows, casting an ominous, shifting darkness across the entire chapel. The air had turned frigid. The flickering candle flames finally went out, one by one, as if the room had been plunged into complete, suffocating darkness. The whispers grew louder. They surrounded the mourners, coming from all directions, their voices melding into one unintelligible sound. The cold, heavy presence in the room was palpable, a weight pressing down on everyone who dared to stay. No one moved. No one could. Fear had paralyzed them all. The atmosphere was thick with dread as the chapel's silence continued, the trembling caskets now at the center of the room's dark mystery. The mourners stood frozen, unable to look away, unable to comprehend what was unfolding before their very eyes. As the lid of Lucy's casket finally shattered, a strange chill filled the room. But this time, it wasn't just the cold air. It was the sensation of something ancient. The faintest of whispers brushed the edges of everyone's consciousness, as though the very walls were vibrating with hidden knowledge. When the caskets were cracked open and the shadows had subsided, something caught the eye of one of the mourners, a detail so subtle yet undeniable, it sent a fresh wave of terror through the room. Markings. Strange, incomprehensible symbols had appeared on the wood of each casket. Carvings that hadn't been there when the bodies were first laid to rest. At first glance, they seemed like nothing more than scratches, perhaps the result of poor craftsmanship. But a closer inspection revealed something far more sinister. These weren't random markings. These were deliberate. They were deep, deliberate carvings, each one intricate and precise, as if something or someone had been trying to send a message, a warning, or even a curse. The marks on Martin's casket were the most disturbing. Lines, symbols, and glyphs that resembled a strange, twisted form of writing, like something pulled from the depths of an ancient, forbidden text. Some marks resembled claw marks. Others had been etched with what looked like burnt edges, as if they had been scratched into the wood using something heated to an unbearable degree. But it was the marks on the inside of Lily's casket that sent a shiver down everyone's spine. The symbols inside the casket weren't just scratched into the wood. They were burned, like something had been placed inside the coffin and set alight, the flames leaving behind scorched, charred patterns that crawled up the sides, wrapping around the casket like a snake. The marks appeared almost alive, as though they had moved of their own accord. Lucy's casket, still partially shattered, held the most unsettling discovery. Beneath the broken wood, there was a single symbol that stood out from the rest. It looked like an eye, an all-seeing eye, but it was etched in a way that seemed wrong, as though it had been forced into existence. The symbol radiated a sense of overwhelming evil, as though it was watching, waiting for something to happen. The moment the eye was discovered, the entire room seemed to darken, and a heavy weight settled on everyone's chest. The most terrifying part: no one knew where these markings had come from. No one had seen them before the caskets were opened. No one had noticed any unusual markings when the bodies were laid to rest. These symbols had appeared in the dark, in the very heart of the chapel, as if they were calling out from somewhere deep and forgotten. The priest, who had been trembling in fear throughout this entire ordeal, finally stepped forward, his eyes wide in disbelief. He reached out a shaking hand toward Martin's casket, the tips of his fingers hovering just above the dark symbols, as though afraid to touch them. He muttered something under his breath, but his words were drowned out by the increasing intensity of the whispers that surrounded the room. The whispers didn't sound like the same voices anymore. They were deeper, more guttural. They were demanding something, pleading for something, yet no one could understand the words. As the mourners stood in terror, the markings on the casket seemed to glow for a brief, terrifying moment. The symbols pulsed, as if they were alive, as if they were feeding off the fear of the room, and the air became heavier with each passing second. No one knew what to do. No one knew what the markings meant. But everyone felt the same thing: that something dark, something ancient, was reaching out through the very walls of the chapel. And it was only a matter of time before it would claim what was its own. As the chapel's atmosphere grew increasingly suffocating, the strange markings on the caskets left the mourners in a state of utter disbelief, their nerves on edge and their minds racing with questions they couldn't answer. The air seemed to press in from all sides, a dense weight of dread hanging over everyone who had dared to remain. It was then that the shadow first appeared. It was subtle at first, a slight movement in the corner of the room, barely noticeable, as if the light itself had bent for just a second. The mourners, already on edge, tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just the flickering light from the broken stained glass window, or the reflection from the shattered candle flames, but the shadow didn't move like a mere trick of light. It seemed to shift with intent, as though it was aware of them, observing them from the darkness. For a moment, it remained still. No one spoke. No one dared to move. The air felt so thick, so unnatural. It was as if the very room had turned against them. Then, it moved. A figure appeared in the shadow, tall, dark, and indistinct, its outline wavering as if it were made from smoke. The shadow didn't walk. It glided. It didn't make a sound. The room grew colder still, the temperature dropping in an instant. A sense of absolute terror settled in every heart. It was as though the shadow itself fed on fear, growing stronger with each passing second. The figure drifted slowly toward the center of the room, toward the three caskets, but it wasn't moving in a natural way. The shadow twisted and undulated, as though it didn't have a solid form, like it was a manifestation of the dark, a being of pure malevolence that existed only to terrify and torment. The room fell into complete silence once more. The whispering voices had stopped. The wind outside the chapel seemed to die down. Even the mourners' breaths were shallow, as they dared not move. They were paralyzed. The shadow figure seemed to be drawn to the caskets, the presence of the dead pulling it toward them. One of the mourners, a woman who had been standing at the back of the chapel, let out a soft gasp as the shadow passed by her. Her face went pale as she stumbled back, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Her eyes locked onto the shadow, her mouth opening in a silent scream. It was then that the shadow changed. It became more defined, more solid. A pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness, piercing through the cold air. They glowed with an unnatural, hellish light, casting a sickly hue across the room. The mourners felt the oppressive force of its gaze, like it was peering directly into their souls. The shadow figure paused. It tilted its head slightly, as though observing the terrified crowd, savoring their fear. The energy in the room shifted. What had been a silent dread turned into something more tangible, a presence, a force that seemed to grow stronger with each second. Then, in the blink of an eye, the shadow lunged toward the caskets. It didn't move like a person, or even an animal. It was more like a wave of darkness, an overwhelming surge of cold and emptiness. The mourners screamed, their voices cracking in terror as they backed away from the entity. The caskets trembled again, even more violently this time, as if the figure was trying to reach inside. The air crackled with an eerie, otherworldly energy, and for a brief moment, the mourners thought they saw something impossibly twisted, moving inside the caskets. The shadow seemed to merge with the caskets, its tendrils of darkness creeping along the edges, crawling over the wooden surfaces like moss, slowly consuming the light. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow seemed to fade into the very walls of the chapel. The red eyes blinked out, leaving the room in complete darkness. The temperature dropped again, colder than ever before. The candles, already extinguished, now felt like a distant memory, their warm light replaced by an overwhelming void. When the lights flickered back to life, the shadow was gone, but the feeling lingered. The mourners were left breathless, their hearts pounding in their chests. They glanced around at each other, unable to understand what had just happened. But one thing was clear. The darkness had taken something. It had touched the caskets, and it was far from finished. The chapel, once again, was still. The strange presence that had hung in the air seemed to shift, becoming an oppressive weight pressing down on the mourners. The cold was unbearable now, and everyone could feel it, the chill that ran deeper than mere temperature. It was the chill of something malevolent, something that wasn't content to just linger in the shadows. As the mourners slowly regained their composure, their hearts still racing, they dared to look toward the caskets once more. But something was wrong. The caskets, Martin's, Lily's, and Lucy's, were empty. There was no mistaking it. The lids that had once been trembling and broken were now eerily still, and the bodies, the very bodies that had been laid to rest in them, were gone. It wasn't just that the bodies had disappeared. The entire caskets were empty. The wood had been scratched and broken in strange patterns, but the corpses that had once filled them were nowhere to be seen. No trace. No sign. The mourners gasped, their voices choked with disbelief and terror. How could this happen? There was no explanation. No one had moved the bodies. No one had touched the caskets. They were supposed to be dead. But they weren't in their resting places anymore. They were gone. One of the mourners, a man who had been standing closest to Martin's casket, shook violently, his eyes darting from one empty casket to another. He rushed to the altar, clutching his chest, his breath ragged. "This is wrong," he muttered over and over, barely able to speak through the tightness in his throat. As the others gathered closer to the empty caskets, they noticed something even more chilling. There were footprints. Small, delicate prints that had been pressed into the dust on the floor. But these weren't the prints of any living person. No, these prints were too shallow, too faint, as though something inhuman had walked through the chapel. They followed the prints toward the back of the chapel. Slowly, cautiously, the mourners moved together, their eyes wide with panic. The trail of footprints led toward the farthest corner, where the shadows seemed to gather once again, twisting and darkening in ways that didn't make sense. Then, they heard it. A soft whisper, just loud enough for them to hear. It sounded like a child's voice, but warped, distorted. It was Lucy's voice, but it wasn't the same playful tone they had heard before. It was deep, hollow. It was as if it came from somewhere beneath the ground. The whisper said, "We're not done yet." The hair on the back of their neck stood up as the ground beneath their feet began to tremble once again. The chapel felt like it was shaking, the walls vibrating, the windows rattling, and the mourners found themselves paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The whisper grew louder, filling the space around them, echoing off the walls, reverberating in their very souls. And then, just as suddenly as the whispers started, the footprints vanished. The chapel was silent again, but it wasn't peaceful. The absence of sound was more oppressive, as though it were hiding something, something waiting, watching, ready to pounce. The caskets remained empty, and the room seemed to close in on them, suffocating the mourners with an overwhelming sense of dread. No one could explain what had happened. No one knew where the bodies had gone, or who had left those footprints, or who, or what, had whispered from the depths of the chapel. But one thing was certain: the dead were not at rest. And whatever had happened in that chapel wasn't over. It was only just beginning.